Hi, everyone. My warmest regards to you for joining us for today's event. My name is Jerry Altamirano. My pronouns are he, him, él, and I serve as the NASPA Disability Knowledge Community Chair and currently work for the Great Gator Nation as the Assistant Dean and Director of the Disability Resource Center at the University of Florida. We are so excited you have joined us in celebrating such an important civil rights law, 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA has undoubtedly created several opportunities for us to better serve our students. And while the ADA has helped to ensure equitable participation in educational programs and services for disabled communities, history tells us that inclusion is not guaranteed by one piece of legislation. Systems that were built to exclude underserved groups do not miraculously change once a law is passed. It takes daily advocacy and intentional inclusion efforts to truly transform our campus. I envision a future where ADA compliance and disability services are no longer needed because universities have been transformed to be inherently inclusive and accessible. With an appreciation for the work that has been done to advance access in higher education, we know that there is still so much left to do. We must continue to move beyond compliance and towards access and disability justice. We hope that everyone will commit to this work ahead and learn how to include disability access in conversations around diversity. Thank you again for your willingness to join us for today's conversation. I'd now like to turn it over to our ACPA co-sponsor.
Hi there, my name is Spencer Scruggs, and I use he, him, his pronouns. I am coming to you today from the original native homelands of the Muskogee Creek Nations. I currently serve as the chair for ACPA's Coalition for Disability and also serve as the assistant director of the Office of Accessibility Services at Florida State University. I'm so glad that you are able to join us today to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the ADA. It's so important for us to recognize and celebrate the impact of the ADA and disability on higher education and how we can look forward toward the future of accessibility and disability inclusion on our campuses. I truly believe that higher education is not able to morph into a 21st century institution without prioritizing these two important tenets of diversity and inclusion. I also want to acknowledge the importance of and address the importance of addressing and acknowledging accessibility and disability inclusion from an anti-racist and decolonization lens, as we cannot fully embrace disability and how much it can offer higher education without also dismantling racist and colonial structures on our campuses. The Coalition for Disability and the disability community we represent is committed to this, and we cannot thank the NASPA Disability Knowledge Community for inviting us as a partner and co-conspirator in this work.
Thank you. Welcome to everyone who is joining. I'm Dr. Danielle Morgan Acosta. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I currently have the honor of serving as ACPA Vice President and Associate Dean of Students at Clark University. I'm coming to you today from the ancestral home and land of the Nipmuc people. And I'm thankful to both the ACPA Coalition and the NASPA Knowledge Community in bringing us together to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Much appreciation to the coordinators of the event, the panelists, and to Spencer for the invitation. In 2017, ACPA committed to the strategic imperative for racial justice and decolonization, confirming our charge as leaders in higher education to reducing oppression of communities of color at the intersections of their identities. We know all oppression is linked, and we are each necessary in the ongoing work of dismantling privilege through research, tools, and personal and collective work, both for ourselves and on our campuses. We believe that accessibility is deeply connected to this, and I'm excited to engage with all of you in this conversation and in boldly transforming higher education. It's such a timely moment of pause to celebrate, reflect, and imagine the future of access in higher ed. The disability civil rights movement has always been about community, justice, and equity, pillars of our work and goals to support students and student learning. The ADA has been important in creating more access to higher education for students and leading to changes on our campuses towards justice and equity. And like many laws, the ADA is the floor of what must happen. We have the opportunities in each of our functional areas and spaces to continue to strive for accessibility at various levels, which is why I'm excited about our time together today, as I find so much value from our professional associations in ensuring that we do more to support students. Personally, I know it is the people in the sessions and lessons that I learned from ACPA that has given me the language skills and resources to better serve our students, whether it was as a young grad student, understanding what universal design was, or currently today thinking about our spaces, events, programs, services, our courses, and access broadly, both digitally and in person. As we know, the past few months have challenged us in a variety of new ways and required us to go back to thinking about access, equity, and how we are providing spaces for everybody in the work that we're doing. Access and accessibility is all of our work, and so I'm so thankful for you being here and for us being able to learn collectively today.
Hi, I'm Kevin Kruger, president of NASPA. It's my pleasure to join you today for today's program, 30 Years Post-ADA, sponsored by NASPA's Disability KC and ACPA's Coalition for Disability. You know, the dream behind every piece of federal legislation is that it changes the landscape of this nation and improves opportunities for Americans. The Americans with Disabilities Act passed 30 years ago is no exception. Those who crafted it had a singular vision that compelled their hard work to improve the chances of people with disabilities to fully realize their potential as contributing members of our society. Nowhere has that been more evident than on our campuses. Along with Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the ADA requires institutions of higher education to acknowledge and protect the civil rights of students with disabilities, to provide every chance for them to learn, live, and engage in the promise of higher education. In its 30 years of existence, the ADA has proven to be a dynamic and provocative piece of legislation, never allowing us to grow complacent in our efforts to change our perspective on disabilities. The ADA is not simply about accommodating those who do not fit into the conventional spaces of higher education. At its core, the ADA is about remaking those spaces to change and improve the experiences of everyone. In higher education, and especially in student affairs, we are well aware of the benefits of diversity. We know that interacting with those who are different literally grows our brains, makes us smarter and more capable. As our campuses have changed over these 30 years to comply with the ADA, compliance has certainly led to growth, improvement, and inclusion for those with disabilities, but also the same for those who don't identify as having disabilities. As we have learned from the concept of universal design for learning, that everyone benefits from responding to some of our more challenged learners. The ADA has improved access and opportunities for all individuals. It has reshaped the landscape, and ultimately, we all have benefited. Going forward, the ADA should inspire us to continue reshaping our campuses, moving responsibility for it out of the singular portfolio of disability services and weaving its expectation into every aspect of our campuses. Compliance with ADA is no longer enough. We must use it to propel us forward, to reconsider everything we do through the lens of ability and difference. In this moment, as our students and fellow citizens demand that we acknowledge the systemic oppression and educational injustices that have limited opportunities for too many of our students, the ADA gives us a framework for inclusion and connection. Now is exactly the time to challenge our profession, and indeed, all of higher education, to recognize ability as a valued aspect of diversity and a legitimate goal of social justice efforts, and to pursue a future in which all can enjoy the innumerable benefits of a college education. I wish you the best today, and I hope the rest of the program goes well. Thank you for having me join you.
We appreciate you all joining us. I see more and more are coming in, so thank you all. Without further ado, our bulk of our program is going to consist of a dynamic panel of university leaders and accessibility champions. So I'd like to turn it over to Joanne Benica, who's going to be the moderator for the rest of the event. Joanne is currently serves as a Director of Disability Services at the University of Southern Maine. So, welcome.
Thanks, Jerry. Sorry about starting a little too early earlier. I'd like to just thank our presenters. We're going to spend the next bit of time asking some questions. And the first thing, though, I'd like to do is have them introduce themselves and say a little bit about your experience. And then we'll get started with some questions. So I think since we're doing take two, let's just start over. And Trixie Ramoso, if you could introduce yourself and say a little bit about your experience. And then I'll call on the next panelist.
Deja vu. Hi, my name is Trixie Ramoso. I go by she, her, hers, and I come from the land of Pavongna over here at University of Long Beach, Cal State University of Long Beach, alum of this SDHE program, and I did my master's thesis on disability orientation, disability identity on college students. And I'm the ACPA Engagement and Membership Coordinator for the Coalition for Disabilities. And currently I work in workforce development as a youth career counselor.
Thank you, Kamana. Sorry, Trixie. Kamana Seymour, can you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your experience? There we go.
Okay. Aloha mai kako. I'm Kamana Seymour. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I am coming to you today from University of Hawaii at Manoa, proud member of Region 6. Here I work in the Office of Residential Life, and in my NASPA hat, I am presently the Region 6 rep for our Disability Knowledge Community. My master's program was actually in public administration, my undergrad in American Studies and Geography. And I identify as a person who is legally blind and have been since birth. I have been through a public education system, K-12, prior to, for the most part, prior to the ADA Act, and continuing and then into higher education post-ADA Act. So prior to 1990, I was subject to laws, both federal and state, that apply specifically to persons who are blind and visually impaired. Following the ADA and the way that implementation has occurred over the last 30 years, I've been a beneficiary and recipient of that law in high school, undergrad, including at a community college and graduate school, and continue to work with our on-campus office, who provide services to all students who identify as disability, whether that's physical, learning disability, visual, audio. I have had the benefit of working with students in residence life who identify similarly to myself and or have needed accommodation, degrees of representation, and advocacy. And one of the reasons I did step into this role is I found that there was a vacancy, and I felt it was time to, I've worked a lot more in the residence life field, and time to work and represent myself, which is where I'm coming from in this aspect.
Great, thanks, Kamana. All right, so if the next panelist could join us and introduce yourself as Tom Thompson.
Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning. At least it's California, it is. My name is Tom Thompson. I'm a retired administrator of disability services. I served as a director of disability services at a large community college in the Chicago area for 30 years. And I now, for about the last 20 years, have been working as a higher education disability services consultant. I did a lot of external evaluations, about 40 different institutions. And I'm doing some longer term contracts now with schools. Currently, I'm working with 2 universities, one online and one that's a traditional residential campus, kind of doing an overhaul of their structure, services, organizational, job descriptions, policies and procedures. So it's kind of new, wasn't something I planned to do, but I got requests to do this. I have been an evaluator of disability services for both NASPA and AHEAD. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tom. And last but not least, Melanie Lee, if you can join us and introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about your experience.
Sure. Thanks, Joanne. And thank you all for being here. My name is Melanie Lee. I use she, her pronouns, and I am all the way out, not as far as Hawaii, but I'm in Utah, Salt Lake City at the University of Utah. And I currently serve as the Associate Director of the Office of Student Success and Empowerment, which is situated on the academic affairs side of the house. And so I always feel like it's super important that I mention that I'm not situated in the DS unit, but instead get the privilege to work with a group of professionals on our campus who are called student success advocates. And sometimes they're referred to as coaches, sometimes they're champions, sometimes they're allies. But their main charge is to support students around whatever success means for them. And so for us, removing barriers and supporting students as they're navigating campus communities that maybe they've never navigated before, or people in their families have never navigated before, becomes a truly important charge and responsibility in the work that we get to do while serving all undergraduate students. And so I'll probably speak a little bit later in some of those questions. But I also come to this work as a big nerd. I'm also a doctoral candidate, and my research agenda includes understanding the experiences and sort of the intersections of disability identity and student leadership on campus, which is how I sort of found this world and started to learn more about who was excluded, the structures of ableism within leadership and involvement. And so I have some sort of interesting perspectives as we're coming to this table today. So thanks for having me.
Thank you to all the panelists for agreeing to participate in this celebratory event of the ADA. Before we get started with questions, I'll make one quick announcement, which is if you'd like to ask a question or have a comment, you can put it in the chat feature, and those will be monitored throughout. So I'll start with the first question, and I'm going to start with Tom, and I'm going to ask you, what are the ways higher educational professionals can make a difference in facilitating access to programs, services, and curriculum for students with disabilities?
Wow. I don't think there is a short answer to that. I think the various people that work there are often common allies for people that work in disability services, a lot in student affairs, some in academic affairs. So I think every DS director, should have as part of their job description that they do a lot of outreach and collaboration. It's kind of even in the mission description that's part of the CIS standards, that's part of the role. But I think it would be great if people from those various constituencies on campus would reach back to the disability services. A practical example would be I worked with a school not too long ago where they had all their new freshmen as a part of their orientation participated in an experiential education thing. There were a couple of different ways, often outdoor activities. It was a couple of days, it was part of like a whole week of orientation, but nobody had ever thought about the accessibility features or part of that. So they just planned it and then everything was reactive. So I use that as an example because I think helping change the mindset. So when people are building something, whether it's a new curriculum or it's a new experience or it's some new configuration of the dorms, if people can get the mindset of, hey, we should go sit and chat with the disability services people so we can make sure that what we're building, whether it's a procedure or learning, that we're incorporating universal design or we're incorporating accessibility. So that's what I would say.
Thanks, Tom. I'm going to ask a follow-up question to Melanie. How can higher educational professionals challenge and bring their colleagues in to promote accessibility and disability inclusion? What decisions must be made in this process to hold accessibility and inclusion as core professional values?
Yeah, so I think that this is actually sort of what we would refer to, this is such a supervision response. This is a multi-pronged approach. I think that there are, at the root of this, it's the foundation of what does it feel like? And I bring that up because Tom, you bring up the example of the experiential learning. And I think that for me as a professional, my first moment was in a space like that. And I said, what would this feel like if? And there was a story recently that was featured, I think, in Inside Higher Ed, that a graduate student at Vanderbilt had created a model of what it would feel like for students on campus in the fall experiencing COVID and making daily decisions around choices of going to class or am I feeling ill? And I think in this particular instance, that student that the story was sort of written about carried multiple identities, multiple oppressed and sort of marginalized identities through their journey. And it was really this reflective process for the person sort of going through it and understanding, what does this feel like? What does this choice feel like? In a way that I think really invites reflection and deep sort of interrogation about how are we building our moments and our spaces. And so I think that challenging learning stories is such a valuable piece of this. And part of that comes when you're on site and you're a professional, but I also think that some of that we need to be challenging our graduate programs, right? I think there's a number of people who have gone through programs who disability identity was never part of what you were learning about in student development theory. You probably weren't learning more than just the ADA in your law course in your master's program. So I think that there are some places and some areas that we could be challenging ourselves as well as our colleagues, but doing it also in a way that invites continued learning, because I think that back to the comments that Monica read from President Kruger were around, now we have to move forward. The ADA in some ways was the baseline, and let's continue to push forward and find new ways to promote access and inclusion. Thanks,
Melanie. All right, Kamana, I'm gonna go to you, and I've got a two-part question. What do students with disabilities share are the biggest challenges they face in navigating their experiences in higher ed?
From my experience and from that of folks that I've worked with either directly or indirectly, the first thing is navigating perception from others and the perception that we either need too much help or that we are unknown, and try to challenge that perception and come to that place where you can advocate and say, this is what I need. These are the resources I need to be independent, which is the goal of most everyone, myself and everyone that I've met so far. And I think the second challenge is navigating places where there are physical barriers beyond just ramps and narrowed sidewalks. The way that buildings are built, narrow hallways, and the way of accessing people that you need to access, typically in person. One of the things that COVID has done in moving us to these online platforms is, in one sense, it took away a lot of those barriers so long as both parties are appropriately tech connected. I think the last barrier really is what comes after that in planning for their next step, the post higher ed life, and how to finally, when you've figured out, negotiated and navigated the barriers within higher ed, within your program or within your physical campus, when you move on to the next thing, whether you're staying on campus as a professional the way that many of us did, or if you're going out into a non-education world, the transition. Those are three things that I think all of us have really dealt with.
That's great, thank you. Does anyone else have any the follow-up is just, in addition to the shared student experience, what do you as accessibility leaders and professionals recognize as other barriers to students for students with disabilities? Oh, Tom, yep.
Yeah, I did. I turned it off while I was in between. This was actually part of another question I was anticipating might come up, but I'll go ahead and answer it here. I think that there's still a lot of hidden access barriers in higher education. I think the two biggest ones in my experience are instructional materials. There's often huge issues for people that are blind or deaf or hard of hearing or low vision, and they're just not known. And if the mindset of how we build courseware and coursework and materials and methods and stuff could change, even if it could just start changing more, it would lower those barriers and it would make less work for the disability services to repair, or have to build in accommodations to provide access. I think there's a lot of digital barriers too. If you follow a lot of OCR investigations, many of them are about these two topics: the lack of instructional materials, or the lack of accessible materials, and digital systems that don't work. Other students can sign on to like a portal and access information, but if you happen to be blind, it may not work with your, with your software. So, and unfortunately, I think a lot of the companies that make those systems that most colleges buy, they're also not thinking of accessibility, even though, they're making some attempts. And I think there's still some facilities barriers out there. We've had more time to focus on that because that was part of the mandate in the original 504 legislation. And then lastly, I think there's just procedural barriers. I don't really have a good sense of how big they are, but in the same way that, at some point in time, we decided that students could get a course substitution, maybe for something like math or a foreign language. That's only an example, I think, of a process where you look at a requirement and you say, well, is there really another way for us to modify this? That's what I mean by procedural accommodations. So I think there's a lot of those that come up too.
Trixie, I'm wondering if you can speak to that question in the context of your role as a career counselor about barriers for students with disabilities. Oh, you're muted.
In terms of barriers, sometimes I don't even look at barriers in those ways. I try to think of diversity or inclusion issues or disability issues as a forethought rather than an afterthought. So instead of what are some ways that's holding someone back, I'm planning for an event for ACPA and building this community on intersectionality with disability and race. Instead of thinking, well, what does this activity, it's supposed to be an interactive kind of activity, instead of saying, what won't make someone participate in it, I think about how do I make everyone participate on it. So does that mean, usually in these two-dimensional virtual platforms, it's only audio and visual. But instead of thinking of what are the different disabilities I need to address, I think about the different senses I want to appeal to: touch, taste, not only vision and audio, learning. So, and then I built it into the rules that it's the accommodations isn't if someone needs one accommodation. This is part of the rules. So in those ways, maybe it really doesn't answer the barrier question, but it's thinking about, I guess, differently than looking at things from like a deficit model point of view to this is just part of the inclusion, part of the diversity conversation in how we do activities, procedures, and things of that sort.
Thanks, Trixie. That was great. I'm going to ask you the next question. We're going to switch topics a bit and ask you, in your opinion, what's beyond the ADA and what steps must we take to go beyond the protections of the ADA?
That one's a tough question for me, as I feel like there's still lots of work to be done within ADA, and even just the confusion within that ADA is applicable more to higher education, but I'm forgetting which act. The IDEA Act is more for K through 12, and how that's not even a seamless process to really get folks to be as successful in college. And beyond the ADA is really taking that next step. It is as a career counselor, it is an employer's market, and I usually work with at-risk populations, so those who have been incarcerated, those with disabilities, and it's sorry to say they're usually the last in line in terms of those kind of opportunities, but they still need to be there. So how are we preparing those who graduate to be ready for those jobs, to be just as highly sought after as everyone else? And So that's really the next step, because the ADA does regulate people with disabilities in the workplace. So making that more seamless and having those conversations is really what's beyond.
Thanks, Trixie. Anyone else want to add to that before I move on? What's beyond the ADA?
Well, I think of, I'll give an example. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a student from a campus that I'm working at with. He's hard of hearing. He's nearing the end of his doctorate. He's doing his research now, and then he'll do his writing in his defense. And he was already thinking about, you know, when I go to look for a job, given the background that I have and all, what do I do about this issue of my, you know, being hard of hearing? So we had a discussion about, when do you disclose? And how do you let a prospective employer know that you might need access in the interview process, or is there a way you can kind of get around that, or is that not possible? And when you're on the job, so it's just interesting, you know. It was good that he was thinking about that. I used to be a rehabilitation counselor before I got into higher ed, and so I did placement with people with disabilities. And I can't tell you how many people I saw turned away who had the ability to do the job because the employer just didn't want to bother thinking about accommodations.
Thanks. Tom, I'm going to ask you this next question. You answered part of it, but we'll just try it again, and maybe there's some additional information others can add to it. But if you were given 1 hour to communicate with a president of a higher education institution to discuss the 3 biggest issues affecting students with disabilities on campus, what would those 3 issues be? And you talked a bit about technology, and I'll let you go.
Sure. The first one, which I won't go into, I was calling that hidden access barriers. Just how do you create an environment where people on their own become aware of the access barriers that are created in something that they've constructed. The second one, I think, talking to a president, I want them to understand is that disability services needs to start off, or often starts off, is the way I would put it, with what I would call baseline resources. I work with a number of schools where the person that I was talking to, you know, was the person who founded the office. But presidents and those that supervise those offices need to understand that those resources will need to grow, because they just do. And because as the population and the complexity of the students grows and the challenges on campuses that exist, which you gradually become aware of. And so one way I frame this for them is that there are at least 4 distinct roles. Whether you want to think of it as a job description or not, there's an administrative role in a disability service office. And if you look at that from the framework of like the CIS standard, the mission standard focuses on collaboration, education, and delivering accommodations for creating access. So, so that's one role. There's what I would call an office operations role, you know, kind of like an administrative assistant person, somebody that makes appointments, schedules, works with the database. There is a role for access specialists or disability specialists, access consultants, whatever you call them. These are the folks that do the onboarding and the follow-up with students. And then there's a role that I would broadly call the need for coordinators of services. Typically in a DS office, the 2 biggest services are testing and alt format. So, and both have some complexity, you know, as you grow in the quantity of people that need that. So there's a role for student workers too, I think, especially in larger schools. A really important role. A lot of offices function well because of student workers that are well trained. So I think if presidents or supervisors understand that, you know, when you start an office and you have a 1-person or a 2-person office, you need to understand they're really doing 4 or 5 things, because they have to do all those things. No matter how many job descriptions you have, those things have to happen. So creative people have to figure out through allies or whatever how to make those happen. And you know, if you're only you're only serving 40 or 50 people, you can probably manage it. But as it grows, it's impossible, and people burn out, people overdo, they work 60 hours a week. So that's the second thing I would talk about. And then the last thing, and this is something that's really been hitting me lately, last, say, several years, because I do reviews and I interview disability specialists, the folks that onboard the new students, I'm seeing that those folks many times, and the people that supervise them, I don't think have done enough thorough training for what that job is, the complexity of the issues that they have to decide around animals, ESAs, around, you know, flexibility accommodations like timeline extensions, attendance, and a multitude of things like that. It's really a critical decision-making process. And because people enter this field in that role and in other roles without having gone through a formal graduate program, because there are only like 1 or 2 in the whole nation, you have to learn on your own by the seat of your pants, or by talking to colleagues, or by becoming a member of a head or a state chapter. So what that job really needs to be, and what I've actually seen happening, and I've seen people in that role at one school that you're only required to have an associate's degree to be a disability specialist. Typically it's a master's level position in most schools. But it just tells me something, you know. I've now done a course that I created and delivered online for 2 schools so far. It's all about this process, the critical decision-making elements, the connection with legislation, the connection with best practices that are out there, how people are handling all these issues. And, you know, it's just been interesting, you know, I feel like, wow, there's like a hole here, you know. The folks are sitting in this job and they're trying to make decisions and they're terrified sometimes. Just read listservs, you know. Listservs, I monitor a private one, and you know, there were like months, maybe a couple of years, where everybody was talking about animals, what to do with this whole animal thing, and then it moved on to something else, and now everybody's talking about, well, hey, the administration is trying to put all the responsibilities for health and safety related to COVID on us, and I'm telling them no. Resist that temptation. Health and safety is not our primary responsibility. That's somebody else's job. You can collaborate with them, but don't let them give you that.
Thanks, Tom. That was great. Yes, lots of anxiety on those listservs around what to do. All right, we're going to move on. Kamana, I'm going to ask you this next question.
Okay.
Can you talk about a time where you witnessed or experienced ableism in higher education? You know, what happened? What did you do? And were there any allies who were supportive?
Oh my goodness. Times that I've witnessed include, I've been doing this particular work that I've been doing for about a decade now. And it actually involved one of our another grad student that we had on our staff that had come from within the program, had graduated and then gone into an ed program and then came on board. And the person sought people that they would confide about their disability and quietly wanted to work with our office, but didn't necessarily want others, including the students that they were going to be working directly with, to know until they were ready at a point to discuss it, because they felt that it was something personal and something that they wanted to be in charge of directing versus, okay, this is where I'm at, open, and this is what I want. In that, we had office people who thought, well, then you don't need any assistance. And some folks are like, no, 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 no. This is a point where the person is trying to control at their own level. You know, just because they're not out there and saying, this is me and this is what I need, does not mean that they are anything different than that. We have to all approach from the standpoint that we must support this person. We must support any person, whichever level that they come into us at, whether they want to be very open or whether they want to be very reserved about it. It led to a period where we had to do a lot of back and forth counseling, and some folks had to work with the students that the grad worked with. And basically, as a point of going through a training that led into allyship versus not just support. In the end, the person was able to finish their program and left, and the person at one point decided that it was in their best interest to be a little bit more open, but was still concerned. The person had since then left higher ed. But the way that people in the office approached, like, well, if you're not going to be clearly open, then we don't necessarily have a need to hold up our end of the requirement. And others in our office said, no, that is not how it is. So it's conflicting, if you can imagine a battle, so two sides kind of going at it in regards to a person in trying to make sure that the person's needs were met and the person was supported in the direction they wanted to take.
Thanks, Kamana. Thank you for that example. Melanie, I'm gonna ask the next question to you, and it is, what would you want other student affairs professionals to know about working with students with disabilities?
Yeah, and I apologize in advance. I think there's a drag race that's happening outside of my house. So if you pick up on any of that background interference, my deepest apologies. I think one of the most important things, particularly in the work that I engage in as a professional, is really staying student-centered in the experience that a student is sharing with you. And I know that that feels really sort of broad. But I think that the more I engage with students around various identities, it's so important to understand how those identities that a student is carrying and those experiences that they're carrying is nuanced and informed by the systems that they're sort of operating within. And so really sort of journeying with a student, because chances are most student affairs professionals have worked with students with disabilities or disabled students and have never known, because it's never something that a student has decided to disclose. And so I think that the more that we can take it upon ourselves as professionals to learn about ableism and learn how our systems in higher education are set up to mutually reinforce ableism, racism, sexism, I think the more that we're going to be able to understand and support students and journey with them as they're, engaging in the college experience. And I think that as we're doing that, we stay authentic to what it is that students are hoping for in that college experience, and supporting ways to navigate some of those barriers and those challenges that have been built and have nothing to do with that student as they're journeying through those systems.
Thank you. That was great. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm gonna pose the next question to Trixie. How can we center anti-racism and fight other forms of oppression within our work of accessibility and disability inclusion?
Well, as someone who managed their ethnic identity before other identities, it's really helped me formulate other parts of me, being a woman, being a professional, a mother, and things of that sort. And because of racism and what you learn from my graduate program, from my undergrad studies, you learn about yourself and what prejudice means. How do you see it in other forms? And I think once you have the basis in one type of identity, that you explore it, it's easier for you to explore other parts of yourself. And then, so now and as you grow older and as you gain more experiences and the society changes, I'm still reevaluating, especially with the current social movements that are happening. A couple of years ago, there was a situation where I got in a pretty heated disagreement with some other folks on an identity topic. And at that time, I was scolded for being angry. But if that situation happened now, it's like, it's okay. A lot of people are angry now. So it's made me rethink, I'm not at that same place. Do I need to be angry again? What does that mean? What does that mean in terms of the context of the other identities I'm imagining as well? So I think there's a lot to explore with that. And one of the things we're doing with ACPA as membership and engagement chair is looking at that intersectionality, because there hasn't been as much conversation on what race and disability look like, and being open about that.
Anybody have any other things to add to that question? No?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
As it sounds like we're all growth minded, we all have a growth mindset. How have you folks who are experts in disability, have you explored what anti-racism means for you in the context of being an expert in another identity? Sorry, I didn't mean to take away, but I was just curious myself.
Great question. Kamana, Melanie, Tom?
For me, it's going back to the foundational aspect of learning what is ally. So in fact, we were just discussing this yesterday. For a lot of folks, engaging in some form of activism leads to learning about the concept of allyship, the levels, and what really defines an ally. Some folks have a very clear, stringent definition. Others are, their levels, you're here, you're here. And then when you explore from the other way around, to really be a functional, solid activist, you also need to have that conscious understanding of what makes an ally and what is it that you're doing that supports that. So in the context of anti-racism, whether it's both societal as a whole, or for our students, and in both cases in working with folks with disability, I think it's having to get that consciousness that it's about a we, and it's not just about an individual. It's about trying to move a holistic society steps forward enough so that when reactions come, it will survive that. And working in diverse societies, parts of it tend to get muddled, and then there are other times where it sort of opens up, and it's like the two things are connected in real ways. If you remove one barrier, you're steps more about breaking down the second barrier, because oftentimes one is used to enforce the other.
Yeah, Trixie and Joanne, if I still have a second, I wanted to respond. I think that for me, the way that I have started to think about ableism and racism, in particular in the world of student leadership, is that most of the leadership development models or scholars or things that are sort of recommended to be read or utilized in a curriculum are very, very white, and they're situated in spaces that are coming from industrial or even post-industrial spaces that are very white, cis, male-oriented, and the structures of ableism are fitting sort of neatly around those ideas around notions of normalcy or abnormalcy, or what's rewarded or what is punished or not rewarded. And so thinking about sort of those dichotomies, but the ways that those have worked together and are in some ways the oppression becomes even more pronounced and stronger, and sort of thinking about if experiences that we hope for students on campuses are that they're getting involved, right? We talk about it all the time in orientation or in the admissions process, or even the application process to get to an institution of higher ed. And so thinking about how are we challenging whiteness and sort of the ableness that is the ableism that they're just really talking to each other. And I think that they're so powerful to disrupt that it's almost, at times I think feels really overwhelming to think about how are we engaging in anti-racist work and anti-ableism work, right, at the same time. And so I don't have a clean answer for you, but I think that that is the space where I for sure am sort of sitting and thinking about, like, how can we, start this revolution in student leadership and involvement and think about this opportunity for students in a new way that really kind of pushes more students into the space of doing things that employers are searching for, right? And they're searching for student leadership experience and the skills that are sort of coming from that. And so if we're not interrogating this, what harm are we doing for disabled students and students with disabilities by not asking these questions of how these systems are sort of reinforcing? So that was sort of a long answer to your question, but you're kind of exciting the nerd over here. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Melanie. Thank you, everyone. So we have just a few minutes, so I'm going to ask this last question to everyone. So maybe just a quick answer from everyone to tell the audience what are some of your favorite resources for people who want to dive in further, either specific to the ADA or about the experiences of students with disabilities. And I'll start with you, Kamana.
Okay, some of my favorite resources are actually blogs written by Kurzweil, and partly because at one point in my life I did utilize Kurzweil software. Another resource is basically just going into Congress and Library of Congress and trying to read up on where things are at with both the law itself, challenges thereof, and or possibly extensions thereof. And the last resource is, to me, really, when I meet somebody and trying to have a conversation, allowing the person to just start to talk, and then if they're willing to disclose more, going from there. So taking that before the challenge and support part comes in, that looking at the student and then just sort of letting them talk and get to that point of self-authorship.
Great. How about you, Trixie?
My favorite resource is, I'm sure everybody uses it, Ask Jan. Because I work in workforce development, it really helps to prepare yourself, knowing how to work with different abilities, what kind of accommodations, and it helps reduce putting the onus on the participant or the student to share with you what that is. And sometimes if they're not willing to share, you can pose those questions. You know, do you need ergonomic kind of items to do your work, and what would that look like, as opposed to me asking the broad question, how do I accommodate you? You know, it helps that it really makes people feel, I mean, I think we all know it helps us and those we serve if we give them the context that we know already. We did our homework with them.
Great. How about you, Melanie? We got a couple minutes.
Yeah, I think that one of my favorite resources when thinking about experience is Bergstahler's Universal Design for Higher Education, that text, because I think that it pushes, to Tom's earlier point around classroom or technology, I think that it pushes us further into spaces like Trixie's note around event planning and program sort of experience. So I think that from a broad brushstroke, I think that there's a lot of implication and transferability in the ideas from that text that can be applied in a lot of different ways.
That's a great text. And last, Tom, do you have a parting resource or something you want to tell people to check out?
Sure, I'll tie this back in with what I was talking about earlier about the critical decision-making part of the disability specialist role. Read settlement agreements and dear colleague letters. They're not easy, they're not fun to read, but what they reveal is OCR is very much about not the decision you made, but the process that you took to get there. And was your process faulty? So when people read those and they'll get the end result, but they'll see, oh, okay, we didn't do part of our process, or we were missing a step. We didn't really do our due diligence. So I think both dear colleague letters are a little bit easier to manage, but I often, when I'm doing training with people, I'll reference things from settlement agreements. It's sort of a model that leads you towards best practices.
Thank you. That was great. So that concludes our panel and our event today. I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank everyone who's on this call and participating in this event. And in closing, we hope that all higher educational professionals will join in our efforts to champion a universally accessible collegiate experience. So I thank you, everyone, and I hope everyone has a great weekend and a good rest of the summer.
Great to meet everybody and work with you on this event.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you.